In this video, I like to address the most common mistakes when landing the standard FSX aircraft with the ILS, the Instrument Landing System. Often ignored is the amount of fuel in the aircraft when landing. The airplanes in FSX are fully filled with fuel by default. If you only do a training pattern, then the plane is much too heavy to land. In reality, the fuel tanks are almost empty on landing. A lighter aircraft is easier to control. I use my home base Hanover in Germany, Echo Delta Delta Victor, to show the most common mistakes. I set fuel to 20%. And you can watch live what difference it makes, right? Now, on the Boeing 737, the 80% less fuel equals the weight of about 9 middle-class cars. So you can imagine the difference how the airplane behaves. Okay, problem 1. It often happens that the airplane doesn't descend when it passes the glide slope. Let's watch the primary flight display more closely. The glide slope indicator here shows a little magenta diamond. It represents the glide slope and moves slowly to the center. When reaching the center, we expect the altitude hold lamp to extinguish and the plane to start descending. But it obviously doesn't happen. Why? What did we do wrong? I pause here and we watch even closer. This red line shows the landing direction. We are still far away. The altitude is 6,000 feet. The navigation radio 1 shows the ILS of runway 27 right and nav 2 Hanover VOR. Everything looks right. But no, we are way too high. As a rule, it is necessary to always intercept the localizer first, before the glide slope. And there's a reason for it. If it would be possible to intercept the glide slope before the localizer, you cannot be sure you're on the correct glide slope and might descend on the glide slope of another runway, other than the one you are aiming for. There would be a risk to hit an obstacle or to ram into the ground. That must be avoided, and that is the reason. Well, it is very important to have or to know the approach charts. According to this chart, you should have an altitude of 3,000 feet by reaching the line VOR. The heading towards the localizer is 23 degrees. When reaching 3,000 feet in time, you will intercept the localizer long before the glide slope. Also, make sure to push the approach button in time. It is okay to push it right after the localizer and glide slope indicators appear. Another mistake is a simple one. Everything looks perfect, but the ILS doesn't work. That is because of this switch. It has to be in the nav position and the ILS is functioning. This problem occurs if you're too close to the airport. Especially if the aircraft is big and heavy It takes the autopilot some time to align the aircraft correctly. If you're too close, there simply isn't enough time for the autopilot to do the task. The autopilot doesn't measure the distance to the localizer, it measures the angle. If you look at these triangles, you see the deviation A from the localizer. In both cases, A is the same distance. The green line shows the distance from the runway. The greater the distance, the smaller is the angle to correct. So, with greater distance, it becomes easier for the autopilot to align with the extended centerline of the runway. As I come closer to the runway, less deviation is allowed. Let's go back into the cockpit to show it. We are a bit too fast and too close to the airport. The glide slope indicator is already heading to the middle. We notice our mistake, and since the localizer isn't captured yet, we set the altitude to 2000 feet. To make sure we are not hitting the glide slope before the localizer. While descending, we are not able to reduce speed properly. We capture the localizer on this lower altitude. The airplane begins the turn, but we are still too close and too fast. At this point, we are crossing the extended centerline of the runway. The autopilot turns further left and tries to get back on the approach path. The airport appears in the upper left corner, and we can see we are far too much north. The autopilot clearly oversteers, trying to reach the approach path. Getting a stable approach out of this situation is almost impossible. Back in the cockpit, we see the indicator moving back and forth as we are crossing the extended centerline. We better cancel the approach and do a go-around. What else can be wrong is the approach speed. Especially if you don't know how to handle the flaps, what they are and what they do. If you didn't try out how several airplanes behave with different flap configurations, you might approach with an improper speed. In such cases, a big and heavy aircraft is hard to control. Which brings us to the number one mistake made by beginners. That mistake is that beginners try to learn landing with a big commercial airliner. Nobody is allowed to fly an airliner before he or she can already land an airplane. That is how it is in real life, and the same, of course, applies to the flight simulator. As real as it gets also means they won't let a beginner fly the big iron or aluminum. There is no airline pilot who wasn't trained to land a small single-prop airplane first. The flight simulator's default Cessna is also equipped with an ILS, doing the same job as the ones in the default heavies. Let's conclude this video doing an ILS landing with the Cessna 172. The autopilot has the same functions. Here is heading, altitude and approach active. Similar to the big plane, heading turns off by intercepting the localizer. The plane turns towards the approach path. Flying much slower than a commercial airliner gives the autopilot and us enough time to establish a stable approach towards our designated runway. We will reach the glide slope shortly and the plane starts descending. Approach now takes over and descends the plane along the glide slope. This plane does not have a modern navigation display to see the ILS identification written in letters. So we use this button and here the identification in Morse code. Thanks for watching, happy landings and leave a comment if you like. Bye bye.